At the start of the JavaScript classes, I said that JavaScript is a key language to making websites dynamic on the client side. So far, we haven't been very dynamic. To remedy this, we'll learn how to get properties from an HTML element that has an ID and change their values and inner HTML. To do this, we use the getElementById function, and this is easier shown in examples than it is to describe. Also know that you should put the document object in front of all of your getElementById functions. This is the only way it's going to work because getElementById needs to use the entire document. Another good thing is to put your script at the bottom of your page instead of in your head section. And this will allow your HTML to load before the JavaScript loads so that your JavaScript will work properly. This way, if your JavaScript loads first and it's looking for something that doesn't exist, then it's not going to work and it's not going to turn out very nice. So first example here, we just have this in a body and we just went over this. Script is at the bottom right before the closing body tag. We have an input, we gave an ID of myID, and the value by default is value. So in here it should say value. With our script, we create a new variable, document getElementById, and we use quotations in here. We just wrote myID. Quotations or apostrophes both work as long as you have an opening and closing one. And this ID has to match this ID, case sensitive. Now that this variable is down here, we want to change the value to JS, put the value in here. And that's exactly what it did. So to make this a little bit easier to read right now, is I'm just going to move everything over like this. And this is what we did. We went document getElementById, myID, dot value, so that's going to change the value attribute, and this is what the value of the value attribute is going to be. So going back to the way it was, assigning this to a variable is just a shortcut. This way we don't have to write this all over again. Now if we're just using it the one time, that's okay. If we're going to use the getElementById function with the same ID more than once, I would suggest putting it inside of a variable. This way you don't have to write this out more than once, like I just said. It saves you time and it saves you space. So what this did was the document getElementById with myID, which matched up here. It grabbed all the information from our element that has the ID of myID. Doesn't matter what the element is, it's not looking for another element, it's not looking for a class or a name, it's looking for an ID. And this is another reason why you should always use a unique ID for every element that you write. Now just because you have an element doesn't mean you have to give it an ID. If you're going to use JavaScript and you're going to use getElementById, then give it an ID. If there are two elements with the exact same ID, then this will not work. So to recap on that, to change the value of something, we just add dot value. And that's an object. That's adding an object to another object. So what this does is the dot value actually changed the value attribute. Now what if we have an element that doesn't have a value? For example, a div. It doesn't accept a value attribute. It only has information inside of it. Well, to do that, we would use inner HTML. So here we have a div. ID is just called test. Inside of it says change me. Well, that's not what our example says. And the reason for that is because document.getElementById test, which matches our div up here, inner HTML is equal to bold tag, new HTML in here, close bold tag. Now this is an example of two things. This shows you that with inner HTML, you can change the inside of any element. You can change this to whatever you like in here. It also shows you that it accepts HTML elements. Because up here, it is not bold. Down here, it is bold. And that's because in here, we said to be bold. I'd suggest practicing this. And that's just because this is an extremely useful tool in JavaScript. And this is something that you're going to want to use a lot in the future to make your pages dynamic. Now we can also change any CSS that we want using this method. The only catch is some names are different. For example, we have background dash color, and we can set it to red, right? In JavaScript, we can't use the dash because JavaScript's going to think that we're trying to minus it. So instead, we write document.getElementById, my ID, and that's just from the example above, dot style, dot background color. So style means we're going to change the CSS style attribute, and background color we removed the dash and made the C in uppercase. This is called camel case when we put two words together, two words or more, and then some words have an uppercase letter instead of lowercase. So instead of a lowercase c, this is now an uppercase C. So what this does is this will grab my ID, which from up here was the input element. It wants to change the style attribute, which is how we directly put CSS into an element, and then we change the background color to red. We use quotations around red because it is a string. Now, camel casing, the best way to describe this is the difference between getElementById down here, where everything is lowercase and it's hard to read, and getElementById, which is a lot easier to read. It's 4 different words put together, and every word after the first one has a capital letter. So one more example here. We have div ID is just my div. Unclick, change BG. The script that we have down here is function change BG, document getElementById, my div, that matches up here, so it's going to get this entire element. It wants to change the style, so it's going to try to add style like that, and it's going to change the background color to red. This is what JavaScript just wrote. Now, it seems like a lot of work, and we're going to touch on this in just a sec on how to make this less work. But for now, I just want to show you that the JavaScript is writing style, background color, it's red. Now let's bring this demo to life. When I click the div, which still doesn't look like it's clickable, but it is, it's going to change the background color to red. Just like that. So I think now would be a great time to show the real power of functions and document getElementById together. Follow with me if you can. If this is a little bit too difficult for you at the time, that's okay. There's quite a bit to this example right now, but let's start going over this. And I'm going to go over it twice. I'm going to go over it right now, then I'm going to do the example, and then I'm going to go over it again. So we have our div ID is equal to test ID inside. That's our inner HTML. We have change this and close the div. Then we have button. Type is equal to button. ID is equal to button. When we click it, it's going to activate the change me function, and this is what our button says. So our div right here just says changes. That matches up there. Our button, click to change. That matches that. Then we have our script. And here's a wonky one. This function is a $. Its only parameter is ID. And what it does is it returns document getElementById and the ID that you specified. Remember how we said we can use a function as a variable value? Well, that's pretty much what we're going to do. The next function is change me. This right here is a function. That's what this is. So our $, and it's going to grab test ID. So what this is just like saying is document getElementById, and the ID that we specified is test ID. It wants to change the style attribute, wants to add a border of 1 pixel, solid red, just like CSS. Same thing for the next one. It wants to grab the test ID from up here, going to change the inner HTML, add a border and this text. Then we changed it. We're going to get the element by ID, but we're going to get the button this time. And that's this one here. The button down here that says click to change, that's our ID. We're going to change the value to change, so it's not going to say click to change anymore, it's going to say changed. And then afterwards, we're going to disable it so that we cannot click it again. And we just go disabled is equal to true. Because true and false are perfect Boolean values, you also don't need to use quotations around those. So let's see what this demo does. In theory, what it should do is it should change the div here that says change this to have a 1 pixel solid red border and change the text in here. It should also change our button to say changed and disable it from being clicked again. And that's exactly what it did. It gave us a 1 pixel solid red border all the way around it. It changed our text, and our button is not clickable anymore. And yes, you can disable a button. To disable a button, you just add the disabled You just add the disabled attribute with the disabled value. And that makes your button unclickable. Now we're going to break this down again. So first we had our two elements. We had a div and a button. The button had an onClick event, and that triggered the changeMe function. So this is our button. Let me get rid of this because it's not disabled. So this is our button. It has an onClick event trigger, and it's going to trigger the changeMe function. That's this one. Then it's going to trigger the $ function 4 times, and it's going to get the ID that we tell it to. Remember, this is the exact same as this. All we did was write test ID in it, and that's our function. For this, we returned it, so that now it's looking for document.getElementById, test ID, style, order. By writing this function, we have saved ourselves from writing document.getElementById, test ID, twice. Same thing with button. Saved ourselves from having to write it twice. All we did was write a $ instead. Then we changed the styling of our div element, like that. We changed it to red. We changed the HTML. That's the wording inside of it. We could have made it bold, we could have made it italic, we could have added other elements in there, but we didn't. And then we changed the value of our button and disabled it. I'd also like to let you know that sometimes when you change the value of a button, it doesn't always work. That's because button doesn't always have a value. Input type button has a value. Button does not. Button has an inner HTML. So what it should look like is button.innerHTML is equal to changed. And with that, that will change our value down here. So remember, the button element does not have a value attribute. It just doesn't, because it has an opening and closing tag. We put our value attribute inside here. If it was an input, then we'd use value. And that's where we would change this to value. And that's what it would look like if it was an input instead of a button. So input uses value, button uses inner HTML. Just remember, inner HTML is anything that's inside an open and close tag. Now, I have an assignment. This is optional. If you do decide to do this, this will be extra practice for you, and it will definitely help your understanding of JavaScript and web development. Again, I want to stress it is optional, but my recommendation, I would do it. This one is not very hard, it's not very long. I'm never going to make you do an assignment that's really, really long. This is just a quick one so you can kind of understand how functions and document.getElementById works. So first, create a new HTML file. I want you to code 2 different elements with 2 different IDs, and one of them has to have an onClick attribute. Create a function to change the styling of one of the elements when they're clicked. And then create another function to change the inner HTML of the second element. So change the styling of one, change the inner HTML of another, and then try adding new HTML inside of the inner HTML one as well. This is where JavaScript gets fun. The rest of JavaScript, in my opinion, not exactly the funnest, but definitely useful to know. And that's basically the programming fundamentals of any language. Now we can get into the JavaScript stuff, which makes JavaScript a unique language and more fun and more dynamic as well.